Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for this important discussion. My name is Robie Madrigal. I'm one of the organizers of the program. I want to keep on schedule, so my comments will be very brief. Let me first thank our faculty panelists, whom our moderator, Dean Mohamed, will introduce shortly. Each has taken time to share their knowledge, insight, and reflections on reparations, a topic that is once again gaining national attention, with several presidential candidates backing legislation to study the issue. I'd also like to thank the dedicated staff, including James Trotter and his ATI team, who worked behind the scenes to set up and coordinate the Zoom feeds and other technical aspects of the program, of which there are many. Thanks as well to Dean Cesar Caballero, the University Librarian, whose support helped to make this panel possible. And special thanks to Professor Jeremy Murray in the back from the History Department for his many contributions to the planning of today's program. I'd now like to introduce our esteemed moderator, Dr. Rafik Mohamed, to my right, who serves as Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. He earned a Bachelor's in Sociology and Criminal Justice from George Washington University and a Master's in Social Ecology from UC Irvine, where he also earned a PhD in Criminology, Law, and Society. His research has focused on domestic drug policy, sports sociology, and issues of racial identity and inequality in the United States. He has authored 2 books, Dorm Room Dealers, Drugs and the Privileges of Race and Class, and Black Men on the Blacktop, Basketball and the Politics of Race and Class, both of which received wide scholarly acclaim. Before I turn the program over to Dean Mohamed, I wanted to read a short quote by James Baldwin. He wrote, "We know, in the case of the person, that whoever cannot tell himself or herself the truth about their past is trapped in it, is immobilized in the prison of their undiscovered self. This is also true of nations. It has been said that in order to make amends for historical wrongs, one must first genuinely acknowledge the harms done." I would like to think that today's discussion is a small but important part of that acknowledgement. With that said, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dean Mohamed.
Good afternoon, everyone. Whoa. Let's see. Oh, that was the first thing on my list here, was say good afternoon, and then I got lost. Anyway, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out today. I know some of it is under duress or you were ordered to be here by your professors or whatever, but I do appreciate you being here and think you'll have a really kind of enriching time being here and listening to our esteemed group of panelists. I'd also like to thank, as Robbie did, the Pfau Library, the University Diversity Committee, and the Department of History for all that they did to bring this together, and for the faculty who encouraged their students to come. I'd really like to thank them too. I'd like to give a special thanks to Jeremy Murray, as Robbie already did. Dr. Jeremy Murray, he's an associate professor of history, does a ton on this campus to bring conversations like this into being, and so I really appreciate all of Dr. Murray's efforts. And I would also like to thank Robbie for all that he does to make these sorts of events happen. I was thinking about you this morning on my way in, Robbie, and thinking about how I have had probably more meaningful intellectual conversations with you just in our passing in the parking lot or wherever we happen to see each other than anybody else on this campus, and I really value and appreciate all that you do to bring that kind of conversation to our campus. So thank you very much, Robbie. Yeah, let's give Robbie some love. So I was asked to set this up, and they said they'd give me about 40 minutes to say whatever I wanted to say, and they said about 8 minutes, I think is what I was given. And since you all got in a little bit late because of the line, I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible. But when I was thinking about this panel, I was thinking about an interview that I heard 2 weeks ago on NPR, NPR's Morning Edition. Anybody that's ever had me in a class knows that I lead a very exciting life. My mornings typically begin with Morning Edition as I shine my head up and everything else and try to make myself presentable for everyone. But 2 weeks ago, it was actually 15 days ago, I was listening to an interview on NPR with author Bill Bryson on his new book about how the body works. And I know you're thinking, what's that got to do with reparations? We're going to get there. During the interview, Bryson and the host David Green had the following exchange. David Green: I want to cover a few things that we learned in your book. One of them was exactly how our first president, George Washington, died after he left office. He came down with some sort of awful throat ailment, And then tell us what happened next. Bryson responds, yeah, he'd retired, you know. He'd won the Revolutionary War and then served 2 heroic terms as president. All he really wanted to do was just retire to Mount Vernon and have a quiet life. And he only just started enjoying his retirement, and he'd been out surveying the plantation on horseback one day in winter, and it was rainy and he got very wet. And when he came home, unwisely, he ate dinner in damp clothes. And then as a result of that, he got some kind of throat infection, really probably no more than a bad cold. But then his doctors got a hold of him and looked into him, and what they did was they started bleeding him, which was the standard procedure for people who were unwell at that time. And then in the end, they drained about 40% of his blood from him, and of course, this had exactly the opposite effect of making him better. It made him much worse, and he died. Later that week, a couple days later, President Donald Trump was defending his now rescinded decision to host the G7 summit at his golf course at Doral in Florida. And Trump referenced our first president saying, quote, George Washington was actually considered a very rich man at the time. George Washington, they say, had 2 desks. He had a presidential desk and a business desk. Okay. Which apparently Mount Vernon, George Washington's estate, said that's actually not accurate, but that's neither here nor there. But what struck me about I listened to both of those stories, and the thing that stood out to me as conspicuously absent was, with respect to Washington's retirement, I was thinking he was retiring to Mount Vernon. I'm originally from the D.C. area. When we were kids, we got on the cheese bus and we went to Mount Vernon and looked at Mount Vernon. And Mount Vernon, then, when Washington lived there and when Washington retired there, was a working plantation. It was a place that over 300 slaves, black slaves, worked and toiled to produce the wealth that Washington used to fund his retirement. And that wasn't Washington's only source of income. He was a surveyor and a land prospector and things like that. But per the people at Mount Vernon, Mount Vernon was a prosperous agricultural estate worked by over 300 slaves. While Washington's wealth wasn't solely attributable to profits gained at Mount Vernon, the plantation's businesses that contributed significantly to his wealth. And while Washington was president, he stayed as closely involved in operating that plantation as he could. That disturbed me because I knew that about Washington, and as Bryson's talking about Washington's retirement, he's not talking about all of the people who produced the wealth that made this possible. And as Trump is talking about Washington's businesses, he's not mentioning at all that one of his businesses was directly tied to servitude by black slaves. And they obscure kind of the centrality of black slavery to our country's very beginnings. What I think a lot of people mistake about slavery in the United States was that it was something that was basically attributable to the misgivings of a few wealthy planters in the South. When, in contrast, slavery in the U.S. and in the Caribbean was a government-sanctioned and corporatized enterprise. It was something that affected everybody's life and produced massive wealth. I don't know if any of you have read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. If you haven't, I think it's wonderful. It's written as a memoir to his son. And in that book, Coates writes, "Never forget that for 250 years, black people were born into chains, whole generations followed by more generations who knew nothing but chains. These were people turned to fuel for the American machine. Enslavement was not destined to end, and it's wrong to claim our present circumstance, no matter how improved, as the redemption for the lives of people who never asked for the posthumous, untouchable glory of dying for their children. You have to make your peace with the chaos, but you cannot lie. You cannot forget how much they took from us and how they transfigured our very bodies into sugar, tobacco, cotton, and gold. At the onset of the Civil War, our stolen bodies were worth $4 billion, more than all of American industry, all of American railroads, workshops, and factories combined. And the prime product rendered by our stolen bodies, cotton, was America's primary export. Our bodies were held in bondage by the early presidents. Our bodies were traded from the White House by James K. Polk. Our bodies built the Capitol and the National Mall." To Coates' point, historian Kenneth O'Reilly writes about all of the presidents and their relationship with race in his book, Nixon's Piano, and he notes that 9 of our first 15 presidents were slave owners, 5 of the first 7. And most of them owned slaves while holding the office of president. Slave labor was used to construct either directly or indirectly through funding the White House, the Smithsonian Institution, Harvard Law School, Georgetown University, Jefferson's home at Monticello, the aforementioned Mount Vernon where Washington resided, the U.S. Capitol building, and the Statue of Freedom that still sits atop the U.S. Capitol building. In his book on reparations, Randall Robinson talks about visiting the U.S. Capitol. And I don't know if any of you have visited the U.S. Capitol building. It's a beautiful place. And you go in there and you walk into the rotunda, and there's all of this artwork all around. And Robinson, writing his book in 2001, talked about how none of the artwork in all of the things that are there in this massive structure reflected a single black person. Yet the building was built with slave labor and funded in part by proceeds derived from slave labor. Robinson writes, the version of America it's making and its heroes was and remains an iconography of an America that is self-consciously homogenous and pleased with itself. And that's what I see as the fundamental problem with how we talk about our heroes, how we talk about the institution of slavery, how we talk about race relations in the United States. We choose to tell and remember stories of our nation's beginning that reflect what Stephanie Kuntz, who's an historian and author, refers to as idealized fiction. She defines idealized fiction as the foggy lens of nostalgia for a mostly mythical past. As time passes, the actual complexity of our history gets buried under the weight of the ideal image. As Kuntz continues, this selective memory is a serious problem when it leads people to try to recreate a past that either never existed at all or whose seemingly attractive features were inextricably linked to injustices and restrictions on liberty that few Americans would tolerate today. A couple of months ago, actually in April of this year, Senator Cory Booker, presidential candidate Cory Booker, announced his intention to introduce a bill to form a commission studying the impact of slavery and continuing discrimination against African Americans. The commission would also make recommendations on reparation proposals for the descendants of slaves. And I know that when a lot of us hear the term reparations, we automatically think of, I was going to joke when I got here today. I was going to come up here and say, hey, I heard this is where I can come get my check, right? It's kind of a crass joke, but you know, I'm crass like that. But a lot of us think that that's it, that it's essentially a conversation about, you know, how black people can get paid, or people who never were involved in slavery owing something to descendants of those enslaved, and we tend to oversimplify that conversation. An example of that was in response to Cory Booker's proposal, conservative black talk radio host Larry Elder commented on Fox News, quote, "This is America, for crying out loud. This is the greatest country in all of human creation. We ought to be taking advantage of the opportunities that we have right now instead of fighting old battles. Let's knock it off and move on." But I think the fundamental issue is that it is really difficult to move on when we, number one, aren't willing to have kind of an open and sincere and fact-based conversation about the extent to which slavery was a part of our country's beginnings and how it was carried forward in different forms even long after the institution of slavery was mercifully brought to an end. And so I'm excited to be here today to listen to what my esteemed colleagues have to say about the issue of reparations and to get this conversation kind of going on our campus, because it's certainly one that we need to have here in the state of California and nationwide. And with that said, it is my pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleagues. I will introduce them, and then I will toss the baton to one, and we will go down the line as we should. Immediately to my left is Professor Kathryn Irvin, Professor of Theater Arts. Professor Ervin is a professor in the Department of Theater Arts and president of the CSUSB Black Faculty and Staff Association. Her research interest is in black theater and black culture and performance. She teaches primarily in the theater department and enjoys teaching the humanities course titled African Arts Heritage. Welcome, Dr. Ervin. Professor. I'll jump the order. This is the order on my script. I mean, I know who you all are, but next on my script is Dr. Diana Johnson, Assistant Professor of History and Ethnic Studies. Dr. Johnson received her PhD in history from the University of California, Davis, and specializes in the history of race and ethnicity in the United States, political activism, and oral history. Her current project chronicles a multiracial history of labor activism, Cultural Nationalism and Transnational Politics based in Seattle and the greater Pacific Northwest during the 1970s and 1980s. Welcome, Dr. Johnson. Seated next to Professor Ervin is Professor Ryan Keating, Associate Professor of History. Dr. Keating's research and writing focuses on race, ethnicity, and gender during the Civil War era. He is currently working on 2 book projects. The first, titled Peace Among the Citrus Groves, Southern California's Civil War Veterans and the Winning of the West, 1865 to 1935, and the second, titled The Silent Service, War Widows and Orphans on the Northern Home Front. Dr. Keating also serves as the book review editor for the journal Civil War History, the longest-running academic journal serving the field. Welcome, Dr. Keating. Next to Dr. Keating is Dr. Rishabh Kumar. He's an assistant professor of economics. Dr. Kumar joined our faculty in economics in the fall of 2017, and his research examines the distribution of wealth and incomes in the long run. Welcome, Dr. Kumar. Next to Dr. Johnson down there is Professor Yumi, assistant professor of English. Dr. Pak teaches courses on Black cultural and literary studies, critical race studies, and queers of color critique. Her research, broadly speaking, focuses on the intersections between African American and Black Scottish literatures and performances as sites of liberatory frameworks and practices. Welcome, Dr. Pak. And finally, we have Professor Marc Robinson, who is an assistant professor of history. Dr. Robinson is an assistant professor of history here at CSUSB. His research focuses on the civil rights and Black power movements, and he has taught courses on U.S. history, Black studies, intersectionality, and popular culture. Welcome, Dr. Robinson. With that said, I shall defer to our panelists, and Professor Ervin, you are first.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, especially my students who are here. I appreciate your presence. Thank you to all of the people who put the panel together. We appreciate the opportunity to present. And welcome to my house. This is the Theater and Performing Arts Building. This space is the recital hall. If you are sitting next to an empty seat, will you raise your hand? Raise your hand if you're sitting next to an empty seat. And I'd like to invite the people who are seated on the floor to come on and move in, please. You'll be much more comfortable, trust me. It's a hard floor. So as I was thinking about the question of reparations, and particularly cultural capital, which is, I suppose, my piece of this conversation, I did some research and some reading, and around that research and reading and the opportunity to go back, I brought you some words from some people you should know, but if you don't, perhaps this will be an introduction. These are pieces from Margaret Walker, Nikki Giovanni, Lance Jeffers, Langston Hughes, and Billie Holiday, and I'd like to do this reparations song on behalf of my students, who this year, more than any other, said, "I didn't know. How could I not know?" Them that's got shall get, them that's not shall lose. So the Bible says, and it still is news. Mama may have, and Papa may have, but God bless the child that's got his own. That's got his own. Not a bad country, neither the best nor the worst, just a place we call home. We open the door to the tired and the poor, to the huddled masses yearning to be free, to those in need, because we need to be needed. We have been believers, believing in the black gods of an old land, believing in the secrets of the seeress and the magic of the charmers and the power of the devil's evil ones. And in the white gods of a new land, we have been believers. Believing in the mercy of our master and the beauty of our brothers. Believing in the conjure of the humble and the faithful and the pure. My blackness is the beauty of this land. My blackness, tender and strong, wounded and wise, my blackness. When a man starts out with nothing, when a man starts out with his hands empty but clean, when a man starts to build a world, he starts first with himself and the faith that is in his heart, the strength there, the will there to build. Then the hand seeks other hands to help, a community of hands to help. Thus, the dream becomes not one man's dream alone, but a community dream. Not my dream alone, but our dream. Not my world alone, but your world and my world, belonging to all the hands who built. We have been believers, yielding substance for the world. With our hands we have fed a people, and out of our strength have they wrung the necessities of a nation. Our song has filled the twilight, and our hope has heralded the dawn. Free hands and slave hands, indentured hands, adventurous hands, white hands and black hands, held the plow handles, axe handles, hammer handles, launched the boats, and whipped the horses that fed and housed and moved America. Thus, together through labor, all these hands made America. My blackness is the beauty of this land. My blackness, tender and strong, wounded and wise, my blackness. Not a bad country, but adolescently indifferent, with time running out on our innocence. Not a bad country, but attention must be paid to how the bounty came to be ours, to all the people who made up the people that we are. Not a bad country. Most likely the best possible hope of human beings to exemplify the differences that can share the prosperity, can tolerate choices, can respect individuals, can teach us all. Thank you.
For the sake of simple order, Dr. Keating, why don't we, or Dr. Johnson, you're next on the list. We'll go Dr. Johnson. How about that?
I feel like I'm not ready. Okay, I have a PowerPoint. Great. Okay, so good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk a little bit about, along with, as my PowerPoint's kind of stating, the New Deal, the GI Bill, and the case for reparations, as this is often a common historical critique or historical argument to bolster the case for reparations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this racist underpinning of these specific facets of kind of government-sanctioned social safety net that's constructed in the mid-20th century, and then make some more direct connections with the case for reparations as I conclude. So I'm looking specifically at really what historians quantify as the creation of the modern middle class. So the legacies and kind of the generational wealth that's produced through the New Deal and specifically different facets of the GI Bill that cannot be understated or underemphasized. And so this is kind of a flip side to the argument for reparations. And I would argue, using this evidence, and as many scholars have done, that we must then look at not only what African Americans lost in these deep legacies of slavery and racism, but what at the same time white Americans gained, and that it's very much tied to these legacies of racism and slavery and Jim Crow segregation. So in looking specifically at the New Deal and the GI Bill today, sociologist Ira Katz-Nelson writes a fantastic book called When Affirmative Action Was White about these specific policies, and he characterizes the New Deal and the GI Bill stating, quote, as the great agent of social policy and change in the New Deal and post-war periods, the federal government produced a series of strange deals that together constituted a program of affirmative action granting white Americans privileged access to state-sponsored economic mobility. So I think the term state-sponsored economic mobility is really key here, and so I'm going to walk through a little bit of what that looked like specifically. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see here a couple of examples. So this is the Fair Labor and Standards Act that's passed in 1938 under the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration. And so it can't be underemphasized that the New Deal is this major moment in American history where for the first time ever, the federal government has decided to come in and take on a leading role in creating a social safety net. But there's a very strong current of racism that runs through these policies. And so these are just a few examples of what that looks like. So through the Fair Labor and Standards Act, part of this New Deal, as you can see here based on the statistics, this piece of legislation, or this aspect of 1930s social change, helped ensure certain working condition protections. It helped ensure or move forward conversations around pay and lower the mandatory working hours that workers in the United States would be expected to put in. So these are very, very important aspects of conversations around labor and working conditions in general. And the Roosevelt administration is seen as something, or characterized as something very heroic and very monumental, but I would argue that there's an important then underbelly. And you can see that here in the fact that farm workers and domestic workers are specifically excluded from these policies in the New Deal. So this is going to affect a large majority, particularly of African Americans, especially in the South, and then it's also going to affect a lot of Mexican American workers in the West. So it's specifically going to leave out, and very intentionally, I want to emphasize, leave out workers of color. How is this done? Why is this done? It really is linked to the overt white supremacy of Southern congressmen at the time, who have a lot of power in Congress, who are on a very important financial steering committees, kind of deciding the nuances or picking out the nuances of how the New Deal is going to be enacted. And it's not President Roosevelt's intention. He actually lobbies for domestic workers and farm workers to be included, but he needs the support of Southern congressmen to make this happen. So this goes into how the New Deal is going to be characterized. If we go to the next slide, I also have some important facts that are very similar in regards to the Social Security Act, passed in 1935, also part of the New Deal. So again, represented in our kind of dominant narrative of American history as incredibly helpful, as very important in lifting up Americans from this depression and then providing a social safety net that's going to carry people from the depression, but also from the working class into the middle class. But once again, you have mass exclusion along racial lines. So you have, in some cases, as you can see represented here, up to 80% in certain areas of the South, where African Americans are wholly excluded from these protections. So from pension protections, from the Social Security Act provides widowed women with protections. It, of course, is providing security for workers as they reach old age. And so you have to think about the cyclical generational effects of being excluded from these policies. And again, this is not rectified until 1954 and is very much affecting African Americans in the largest numbers. And then if I go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the specifics of the GI Bill that are in some cases very similar. But I would argue have even more of a long-term effect, so even longer-term legacies of how wealth is accumulated and controlled in the United States. So this is, again, part of the Roosevelt administration, is, of course, going to be accessible to veterans who had served in World War II and come home, and there's this effort for people by the federal government, so state-sanctioned resources that are going to be doled out to people who had served in the military and their families. So there's also going to be unemployment benefits that go along with this if you can access the GI Bill and you don't have a job. Access to universities that for most Americans had been very much out of reach. So you're going to be able to pay tuition with the GI Bill. There's going to be support for your family, your spouse, as you attempt to gain access to college. And this is also a really important moment in what historians of race call kind of the broadening of this category of whiteness. This is when people who had not kind of been under the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant category, people who are Catholic, people who are Jewish, are also going to have, in the first time, mass access to some of these resources, like access to colleges and universities. And so historians write about this as this big moment when this umbrella category kind of white, or actually the term Caucasian being popularized, is being used. So we have more and more large access to resources for people with Euro-American ancestry. And then there's various ways that these policies of the GI Bill are, again, intentionally excluding African Americans. So in regards to education, this has a lot to do with simply the segregation that is very much in full force in regards to universities across the country. So we do not have desegregated schools at this time. And in addition, black colleges and universities there's much less in numbers and much lower numbers of funding. So even though 2.5 million African American men had served in the military and have access to the GI Bill, whether or not you can actually implement that access in a really concrete way is the question that historians specifically look at. And going to the next slide, housing is probably the most monumental shift that occurs under the GI Bill. So this is our moment when really through property ownership, and we know this around conversations today in terms of who has access to the middle class, and then can you pass that wealth down to your children, right? That legacy of generational wealth is really for so many millions of Americans created here in the 1940s and 50s through the GI Bill. This is the moment when the federal government pushes single-family home ownership like never before and creates patterns and cycles that are very much still with us today. The idea that this is the American dream, and if you can access it, you can move up the economic ladder squarely into the middle class, and then help ensure also that your children are part of that also. So we have huge, huge percentages of housing built. I think 1 in 4 homes by 1960 had been built in the 1940s and 50s. So huge numbers of home ownership that are surging, but it's very much done, again, along racial lines. So you have access to this predominantly for white Americans. How does this occur? If I go to the next slide, this is our moment when these policies are very much intersecting with what we call redlining. So I have some examples here of different maps, right? We have Los Angeles pictured here, but also other cities like Philadelphia and Detroit. So it's very important to remember that these racist policies are affecting the North and the West, right? This is not something that's just exclusionary to the South. And you can see by the kind of wording that I've chosen here to kind of pull out from the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, that has constructed these maps, that there is an intentional effort to determine which areas of cities are going to gain access to these new homes. So what redlining means is essentially the FHA will outline certain neighborhoods and sort of color them in, as you can see here, with red. And those areas will be deemed subpar for mortgages, for business loans. And if you really took an overlay of these maps, so distributed in the 1930s, and you overlay them with maps that outline the racial demographics of the cities, they pretty much are exactly in parallel. So the areas that are red are predominantly African American or other communities of color. So what does this mean? It means even if you have access to the GI Bill, you cannot, in many cases, go to a bank and get a business or home loan if you live in one of these redlined districts. So again, major barriers to this generational cyclical wealth. There's also some important parts of the conversation going on in regards to what if you want to move out of these red line districts. So there's a whole host of literature about the racism inherent to real estate agents also. So there's, even if you were an African-American family attempting to move out of these districts, a lot of real estate agents and banks would simply not, even at that point, offer you a home or business loan. Going to the next slide, I have a map here also of Detroit's black neighborhoods in 1940, which is a common city that historians look at to kind of bolster this argument around access to wealth in the 1940s and moving forward. If you actually looked at this map and then you look at the racial demographics of Detroit, so here's the black neighborhoods pictured here, it's almost exactly the same today. So there's deep, deep legacies that are still very much affecting cities and African American communities today, stemming from these mid-20th century phenomena. And then the last slide I'll kind of show you too is issues of freeway and urban renewal that are happening in cities across the nation at this time. So you have the Second Great Migration stemming from so African Americans moving out of the South, having access to money through the GI Bill, having access to higher income because of wartime industries that they'd served in. And so you do have people moving out of the South into cities like Detroit, but then at the same time that African Americans are facing a lack of access to home and business loans, the African American communities that still remain in a lot of inner city areas like inner city Detroit are actually physically being pummeled and destroyed by freeways. So as African Americans move into cities, you have this phenomena called white flight. White residents want to leave, but they still need access to the city for various reasons. What does that mean? You need freeway development. And almost wholly across the board in the nation, if you look at where freeways are constructed, it's through communities of color. So I'm going to kind of conclude with some of these major points, but just I want to make the point that this evidence is very much in conversation with the context of the case for reparations. So I would argue using this evidence that the argument about reparations can not only be, the incredible violence, legacies of slavery and segregation, but we also have to look at that state-sanctioned mobility that white Americans have been granted, that this is providing cyclical generational wealth. And I would just conclude by saying, as a counter to some of the critiques also of reparations, that state-sanctioned resources allocated to Americans based on race is actually a very core element of American society, but just that white Americans have traditionally been the majority beneficiaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Dr. Keating.
Thank you. I just wanted to first thank Jeremy and Robbie for organizing this panel, all my other panelists for being here, and then all of you for coming to listen to us and taking time out of your day to participate in this. Well, the question for or regarding reparations for slavery has become an important issue facing the nations, so much so that today's Democratic presidential candidates have been compelled to address their support for this. I'd like to go back a moment to provide some context for the initial impetus for reparations, why it failed, and I think the broader consequences of that failure. As southern states moved to separate from the Union in the winter of 1860 and the spring of 1861, the leaders of the secession movement placed the future of chattel slavery, their peculiar institution and the backbone of their economy, in the hands of their citizen soldiers. Despite stunning successes along the Richmond-Washington front during the early years of the war, the prospects of the larger war effort appeared grim for the young Confederacy. Reconstruction in the South, as we know it, was a fluid process that began almost as soon as the secession crisis started and escalated rapidly as large swaths of territory fell under Union control. As Union armies liberated millions of slaves, the political and social reconstruction of their lives began in earnest. This was a watershed moment. As a nation wrestled with the wounds of war, they also struggled to make sense of the new society that emerged from the rubble, one in which former slaves were now participants in the democratic experience, or allegedly so. As the federal government and the military grappled with their new role as liberators, leaders on the field and in Washington began to conceptualize a new way to rule. Implemented or imagined first in 1863, the Freedmen's Bureau was established to provide support for these newly freed men and women as they navigated their new environments. Although the Freedmen's Bureau ultimately suffered the cruel fate of government apathy and racism, its conception nevertheless marked an important shift in the way that people understood the role of the government. Social and economic experiments followed broader comments by some Union military commanders regarding not only the condition of freedmen in their vicinities, but also the means by which these conditions might be remedied. In the winter of 1863, for example, Benjamin Butler issued General Order Number 46 to the 18th Army Corps. He wrote, "In consideration of the ignorance and helplessness of the Negroes arising from the condition in which they have been heretofore held, it becomes necessary that the government should exercise more and peculiar care and protection over them than over its white citizens accustomed to self-support, so that their sustenance may be assured, their rights respected, their helplessness protected, and their wrongs redressed." Important here is the way in which Butler imagined the role of the government, not as a passive, aloof force, but rather an active agent in implementing and guaranteeing change. Tasked with this oversight and mission, the Bureau of Negro Affairs, the predecessor of the Freedmen's Bureau, was charged with implementing this change in process. In February of 1864, Butler issued another order mandating that, quote, "all estates in this department abandoned or now occupied by rebels will be turned over to military commanders to be taken possession of by the superintendent of Negro Affairs or the Treasury agent." And a year later, further steps were taken. He wrote, quote, "when this land is found deserted by the owners or in possession of the Color Bureau, and where farms are cultivated by colored persons on their own account or under the direction of officers of the Bureau of Negro Affairs or by the government agents then working on such farms or lands, will be considered useful employment, and the colored population will be encouraged in such labor." Similar scenes played out across the South, most notably in Georgia, where William Tecumseh Sherman issued Special Field Order 15, in which he sought to solve the economic crisis facing freedmen by breaking apart plantations, a precursor to the policy of 40 acres and a mule that never came to fruition in the wake of the war. As the Army and government struggled to deal with coordinated efforts to help this quote-unquote army of refugees, they utilized the Freedmen's Bureau as a medium through which former slaves could gain political, social, and economic agency. It was, W.B. Du Bois noted, the, quote, "most extraordinary and far-reaching institution of social uplift America has ever attempted, a government guardianship for the relief and guidance of white and black labor." Though the Freedmen's Bureau would never have existed without the urgency of the war, Republicans were certainly open to the idea of a more progressive role of the government and its involvement in the everyday lives of Americans. Indeed, Charles Sumner noted the necessity of a more involved government in 1864 in his defense of the Freedmen's Bureau bill when he wrote that, quote, "as they derive their freedom from the United States, it must proceed from the national government. This alone can supply the adequate machinery and extend the proper network of assistance with which the unity of operation is required. The national government must interfere in this case." 2 years later, Senator Thomas Elliott echoed these words when he spoke out in defense of the Freedmen's Bureau, whose existence was threatened by President Andrew Johnson's veto of a bill that would have put this agency in place indefinitely. "Mr. Speaker," he said, "whenever we turn in our legislative path, we encounter questions of freedmen and freedmen's rights. They face us everywhere. No peace can come that will stay until the government which decreed freedom shall vindicate and enforce its rights by appropriate legislation. The power to liberate," he continued, "is now confessed involved the duty to protect, and the Freedmen's Bureau is an early legal recognition of this." Though Republicans embarked on this with high hopes, the agency was also castrated by hesitancy and accommodation, and the power of whiteness ultimately subverted a multiracial alliance that may well have upended social, political, and economic order in the conquered South. I bring these up to note two things. First, the idea of federal intervention on behalf of a people in circumstances where they could not do so for themselves in their individual capacity was present in political rhetoric as early as 1850 and underpinned Republican and especially radical Republican ideology throughout the Civil War and Reconstruction. Yet this rhetoric was constantly under assault by moderates and Southern whites, and especially prevalent in the wake of the war as former Confederates grappled with reasserting power over the new social and political reality that was the South after emancipation. Secondly, though, is the question of how federal government might truly impart change in those areas. The idea of 40 acres and a mule, which would have been, in essence, reparations for slavery in the immediate aftermath of emancipation, would have been the fundamental mode through which power could have been restructured in the South. Land ownership would have given freedmen immense power, especially if that land ownership would have come at the expense of plantation owners, simultaneously breaking the hold of rich white men on the political process in their states and granting that role to freedmen. The failure to impart a truly radical social change in the South by giving freedmen what they needed most, land, was, in my opinion, the greatest failure of Reconstruction and the thing that had immense and immediate social and political and economic consequences that still impact black communities to this day. Landlessness forced men and women into sharecropping, freed men and women fell victim to the resurgence of white power, and the implementation of Jim Crow laws were nothing less than second slavery. Let me give you some numbers from 2012 to illustrate the far-reaching impact of this process, or the failure of this process. In 2012, 27.4% of African Americans lived below poverty level, compared with 15% of Americans nationally. 45.8% of black children under the age of 6 lived in poverty, 3 times that of young white children. 36% of blacks and 38.1% of black women were employed in low-wage jobs, compared to 23.4% of the U.S. workforce as a whole. And the median wealth for black families in 2010 was $4,900 compared to $97,000 for white families. The median household income for black families was 61% of that of white families. And this is all a consequence of systematic and endemic racism that undercuts our nation from north to south, east to west, from urban spaces like Detroit, Michigan, to rural communities like Philadelphia, Mississippi. And I'd like to conclude here. When we talk about reparations, we certainly it certainly would go a long way in forcing a national conversation surrounding the brutality and inhumane conditions that African American men and women and children toiled under for more than 200 years. It would bring to light the role of these individuals in the growth of the United States and cement their struggles as part of the national narrative. And this is something that we must acknowledge, and we cannot simply brush under the table or downplay. But we also must acknowledge what happened in the wake of the Civil War and in the destruction of slavery. The failure of politicians and the fact that the public turned their backs on those most in need and left them to suffer under the yoke of a hostile and brutal white regime hell-bent on recreating a system of chattel slavery in whatever ways possible had far-reaching effects that are still present today and that are, as we've seen, very, very difficult to overcome. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Keating. Dr. Kumar.
So I'd like to start by first thanking Jeremy Murray for inviting me for this panel. I'm an economist, and I think about wealth inequality a lot about the U.S., but also a global perspective. But thinking about reparations, actually, I should start by saying that I simply do not know as much as my fellow panelists. I'm not a historian. I teach aspects of the inequality in the United States. And of course, it's impossible to talk about these issues without thinking about the institution of slavery. But when this panel came about, I reached out to some friends, most notably Professor William Garrity Jr. at the University of North Carolina, actually at Duke. He is one of the leading voices in the academic movement for the reparations proposal. He sent me some material on this. It just happens to be that some other friends are actually very strongly involved in this movement. Some of my friends and colleagues from when I was in graduate school, including Derek Hamilton, who is part of Elizabeth Warren's policy panel, and he's actually involved in the reparations panel. So they gave me a lot of material to think about. And what I'm going to do is take a very analytical perspective, a political economy perspective to the question of reparations, not so much about the history, which people already know about and need to know about more, but I'm not the expert on this field. So let me start by saying, by kind of listing what reparations really are. The proposal suggests a 3-point program. The first is an acknowledgement of responsibility that slavery was a brutal institution. This needs to be acknowledged. This, to begin with, is a challenge because no country in the history of the planet has ever actually acknowledged any past injustices. The Turks still do not accept Armenian genocide. The British do not accept the consequences of colonialism. They are not willing to make that official acknowledgement, because the day you do it, you link the past to the future. The state today acknowledges that link exists with its past. It's very difficult to begin with. The second is, the second part of the reparations proposal is a redress, a monetary compensation, which kind of mimics the 40 acres plan that was originally proposed. We acknowledge that there is injustice and it needs to be compensated, a monetary compensation. Remember, we live in a time where we are not able to come to terms with a 2% wealth tax on the wealthiest 400 families in the United States. So another challenge to think about. I mean, the US is a great nation, but on many, many, many things, it is not willing to have very important conversations. The third is more contentious, and I will focus on this, and I believe that the case for reparations is not as extreme and as radical as it actually could potentially be. The third issue is closure, a settlement of debt. And these academics propose that if we acknowledge and redress the case for reparations, then the African descendants of slavery should accept that the debt has been settled and we move on. So that's the third point behind this. Now, is there a need for redressal in the United States? People have already mentioned and demonstrated. In my field, in economics, in wealth distribution, in economic mobility, these are the leading topics that we are talking about right now. Geography determines economic mobility. What determines geography and where you grow up? Your race. In the United States, the US is very much a class, ethnic society. Let me just give you some figures on the racial wealth gap. If you were to rank every family in the United States from the richest to the poorest, right in the middle, the family that would be right in the middle would be worth $97,000 right now. That's the total value of their wealth, mostly home ownership. If you exclude all other races except whites, the median wealth level goes up, so the family in the middle goes up to $171,000. Again, more valuable houses. If you exclude all races except African Americans, the median wealth in the United States goes down to $17,000. So that's a whole family. That's a working household with children involved, $17,000 US. Obviously, this is extreme wealth concentration in the United States. It's extreme wealth inequality. A lot of this has to do with wealth concentration and economic policies. The rich are getting richer, okay. But one of the major drivers of wealth inequality in the United States is actually the fact that there is no economic mobility for African descendants of slavery. So obviously there is a clear and measured basis for reparations. Then there are structural outcomes. Everyone knows about this, but is unwilling to sometimes to accept the actual outcomes. The racial health gap. African Americans on average live less longer than other Americans. The racial opportunity gap, the racial unemployment gap, the racial quasi-segregation, institutions of racial quasi-segregation, which still exist, and social evidence, especially police brutality. I am an immigrant and a person of color, and I had to come to the United States to learn what racism really is. I lived in the ghetto in New York for the first 2 years of grad school. That's when I really saw what racism is, not inflicted against me, but against African Americans. So anyway, do reparations make sense? They do, because the policy proposal says the following. A reparation should entail monetary compensation to redistribute wealth to at least represent the population. What this means is that 12 to 13% of the population in the United States is African Americans. They currently own 2 to 3% of national wealth. That's, to begin with, an extreme level of inequality. This needs to be brought up to 12 to 13% to start having a conversation. That is, if African Americans represent 12 to 13% of the US population, then they should rightly, given historical injustices, they should be entitled to at least 12 to 13% of national wealth. And there are examples of these reparations actually happening. For example, restitution to Japanese Americans for internment, and to Holocaust survivors for the Second World War and the Nazi regime. But I actually want to present a critique which is slightly different, and which actually critiques the program for reparation itself, not because it's not needed or because it's not just in some way, but actually my take on reading this material and thinking about this from a very Marxist analytical perspective, a very brutal perspective to think about it, I mean, a kind of a ruthless perspective, is that it's clearly not extreme, because it actually does not address the origins of slavery, which is actually not just the institution of slavery, but the institution of private property on which the United States was formed. There's three components. The first is that there should be monetary compensation for historical injustices which explain today's social inequalities. The second component is closure. The problem is solved. If this program works, it proves that liberal democratic capitalism has a solution for any and all injustices, because we end up creating a market, and that market can essentially solve any, I mean, capitalism, the great thing about capitalism is that it can create a market for anything. Today we see this with Uber and Postmates, where our leisure time is marketized, turned into a commodity, and then sold. This is not, I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm just telling you what the mechanics of capitalism is from the perspective of an economist. So, leisure time marketized. Similarly, when we think about what reparations entail, that is, a debt will be settled once we pay off these reparations, we are saying that whites and African Americans come to a market. They meet to negotiate an equilibrium price for these injustices. The moment that price is settled, the market is cleared. In a sense, whites have bought out those historical injustices. So think about what we're actually saying when we say something like, when we propose a pure monetary compensation program in terms of reparations. We are saying that there is a market for everything, including historical injustices, and any historical injustice or contemporary injustice can be bought out in the future at the right price. I think this is it's kind of the times that we live in, that we are not willing to accept how extreme the past was, how radical and how brutal the past was, in that we are able to moderate out our solutions today. The problem with slavery was, to begin with, the institution of private property. Very new, remember, this has barely 200 to 300 years of history. Capitalism is 200 to 300 years old. There's no guarantee, given what's happening in Hong Kong and Chile, that this, or Brexit, or the United States, that this is necessarily the system of the future. But regardless, if we do accept the reparations program the way it is, then we are accepting that capitalism is the way forward. It was the way of the past. We buy out those historical injustices of the past, and we continue along those lines. And to me, given the magnitude of injustices, it's perhaps not as extreme and as radical a solution as is actually merited by when you actually read accounts of what happened in the past. Slavery is an extreme application of capitalism. It is basically a capitalist's dream, because capitalism is a system where the capitalist and the labor enter into a contract of exchange. The means of production are owned by the capitalist. The worker provides labor time. In exchange, the capitalist compensates in the form of wages. That's standard unequal exchange. That's why we have inequality and so on and so forth. But slavery is an extreme application where the worker's labor rights are taken away and the worker becomes capital itself. So the worker, instead of being labor, is, effectively speaking, property in the system. So I believe that when we think about the issue of reparations, we should not think about it as an issue which we want to solve necessarily within the same system that we exist in. We should be thinking about this on a broader basis, because if we accept that reparations are acknowledgement, absolutely necessary, but like I said, it will set a precedent. It will set a precedent that we are not willing to accept, that we are not willing to invite, because we live in a very narrow, our focus is fairly narrow. It's actually a much broader conversation to be had about the system that we live in and whether we want to accept any compensation for historical injustices through a price mechanism within that system. So if I was the president today, would I choose reparations? If I was a Democratic president today, would I pass a law on reparations? Yes, I would, but that would be the easy option. It's a very easy option because it says there's a price for everything. I can commit any injustices I want today, and 100 years down the line, through some tax and redistributive policy, I can do it. I can pay for them, or the United States can pay for them, or the world can pay for them. And it, to me, does not, in a sense, it's not as radical a solution as we need for these kinds of historical injustices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kumar. Dr. Pak.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes, cool. So I kind of love that I'm getting to go after Dr. Kumar, because I think my paper is maybe in conversation with his argument. So the tentative title for what I'm going to talk about today is Reparations as Structure, Reparations as Speculative. I'm going to start kind of with what seems like a tangent, but I hope that it'll connect. Okay, so in a March 2007 issue of The Guardian, Jackie Kay, who is the third Makar or Poet Laureate of Scotland, wrote the following. She wrote, "Being African and Scottish, I'd taken comfort in the notion that Scotland was not nearly as implicated in the horrors of the slave trade as England. Scotland's self-image is one of a hard-done-to wee nation, yet bonny and blithe. I once heard a Scottish woman proudly say, 'We don't have racism up here. That's an English thing that's down south.' Scotland is a canny nation when it comes to remembering and forgetting. The plantation owner is never wearing a kilt." During the summer of 2015, I saw the truth of the matter firsthand myself, as I came face to face with 4 seemingly innocuous landmarks that actually serve as reminders of Kay's argument of this remembering and forgetting. I was in Glasgow, spending the summer there, conducting archival research at the Mitchell Library. I decided to go for a walk, and there in Merchant City, I found them one after another. There is a Jamaica Street in Glasgow, there is a Virginia Street in Glasgow, and there are 2 plaques, one commemorating the tobacco and sugar trades during the 18th and 19th centuries, and the other, the Virginia Court, which informs walkers on the Merchant City Trail that, quote, "tobacco lords worked here from 1817. I found it again in summer of 2018 when I went as co-director for our campus's study abroad program in Jamaica. The faculty house I stay in is called Aberdeen, which for those of us who don't know, is a major city in the northeast of Scotland. So that's the tangent, but I promise you I'm going to try and make it connect. 2 months ago, the University of Glasgow, whose rectors include Robert Cunningham Graham, who made his fortune through the selling and owning of slaves on his plantation in Jamaica, both acknowledged its institutional benefiting from the Atlantic slave trade and committed to paying £20 million, or roughly 26 million US dollars, in reparations over the next 20 years, or what they call reparative justice. This came after a university commission study taking place over 3 years resulted in a report that stated that the almost 600-year-old university had received bequests and gifts in the 18th and 19th centuries from people involved in the slave trade that were worth as much as £200 million today. The university acknowledged that the study found that as an institution, the University of Glasgow had not actively participated in the trade of sugar, tobacco, or people, and in the case of the last, their wholesale kidnapping, torture, or murder. At the same time, university leadership stated unequivocally that that did not matter. What mattered was that it had been built on slavery, perhaps not through slave labor, but through the money that resulted from the commodification, objectification, and degradation of stolen Africans and their descendants. This project of reparative justice is to be conducted in partnership with the University of the West Indies, and its primary form, although by no means its only form, will be the establishment of a center committed to collaborative research on slavery and anti-Black racism on an international scale. Other suggestions from the study's authors included the establishment of funding sources for students of color and faculty positions specifically committed to the study of the Atlantic slave trade and anti-Black racism, or what the journalist Peter Fryer has called a principal handmaiden to empire. The point I wish to make today is this. In order for reparative justice to take root, we must understand and pursue reparations as a Black feminist project. Robin Kelley points out that one of the first agitators for reparations was Sojourner Truth, who stated in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, quote, "America owes to my people some of the dividends. I shall make them understand that there is a debt to the Negro people which they can never repay. At least then they must make amends," end quote. The question of debt as something that can never be repaid has been instrumental in critical university studies. For example, if you're interested, Stefano Harney and Fred Moten work on the Undercommons where they talk about this. and particularly as more and more universities in the United States grapple with their own ties to slaveholders, plantation owners, and slaves. And if you're interested in that, Craig Stephen Wilder has a really amazing book called Ebony and Ivy, Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of America's Universities. What I'm interested in is that Sojourner Truth acknowledges that the damage wrought by the Atlantic slave trade and subsequent chattel slavery is a debt that cannot be repaid. One can never repay, as one can never be restored to any form of mythological purity, innocence, or parity. To quote Walter Mignolo, if coloniality is the underlying logic of the foundation and unfolding of Western civilization from the Renaissance to today, then slavery, as Colson Whitehead tells us in his Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Underground Railroad, is an engine that did not stop, its hungry boiler fed with blood. One quick example I can give you is what we know today as modern medicine, how my doctor treats me, how your doctors might treat you, is developed in part out of the medical experiments that were conducted on slaves, on slave ships, and on plantations. So the question for me is not about if my ancestors owned slaves. As with the University of Glasgow, the question is about how I continue to benefit from slavery's existence and its afterlife, right? And my students and I talk about this a lot. The kind of concept of the afterlife of slavery comes from a scholar named Saidiya Hartman, where she says, we don't want to think about it as an aftermath, right? Because aftermath indicates it ended and we've moved on. Afterlife indicates it's still with us in different forms and shapes, right? Rather than demanding repayment, which I read as a finite transaction, truth instead uses the language of making amends, which has also meant historically to reform, or interestingly for me, to free, right? To read truth's call as one solely about repayment would miss the grander scope of her argument, which finds its echo in W.E.B. Du Bois's closing statement in his 1903 publication, The Souls of Black Folk, where he cautions what he calls a proud, headstrong people to listen to the warning that emancipated African Americans offer at the turn of the century, lest the nation be stricken or smitten with the curse. I interpret truth's call for reparations as amends as calling for structural shifts to reform and a project of liberation for all to free. In the University of Glasgow's commitment, which is about a permanent shift in its infrastructure, which is also then about a permanent shift in how the university imagines its future, I see a kernel of what we might call Black feminist thought. I want to argue, in closing, that what Black feminist thought offers us is the speculative, the capacity to imagine that which has yet to be, indeed, that which has yet to be imagined. Rather than address the question of how or who will pay, which is so often where this conversation goes, I want to instead consider why we believe reparations to be impossible. What happens if we accept that reparations are not only possible, but necessary, not only for reparative justice, but for understanding that we do not have to accept the world as it is now, that other worlds are possible? I turn very briefly here to a contemporaneous figure of Sojourner Truth's, Harriet Jacobs, and her luminous theoretical text on the intersectional and co-constitutive construction of race, gender, and sexuality. Of course, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which is published in 1861. Playing with the tropes of the sentimental novel and the captivity narrative, as well as conventions of the cult of true womanhood, while simultaneously writing under the duress or the heavy editorial kind of gaze of her editor, Lydia Childs, Jacobs offers us a text that is rife with moments of what someone like Candace Chu calls, in a different context, imagining otherwise. I'm going to give you a very quick example. At the end of Harriet Jacobs' narrative, she wins her freedom, right? And someone tells her, your friend, Mrs. Bruce, bought you your manumission, right? Like, this is how much you are worth, and Mrs. Bruce paid for this, and now you are free, right? And Harriet Jacobs says, someone says to her, I've seen it's true, you're free, I saw the bill of sale. And she says, the bill of sale? These words struck me like a blow, so I was sold at last. I well know the value of that bit of paper, but much as I love freedom, I do not like to look upon it. Rather than giving us a triumphant narrative of freedom finally achieved, Jacobs instead demonstrates the inherent contradiction in the division of slavery and freedom as constructed through whiteness and white definitions of the state. To be a slave is to be owned, but to be freed in this context is to acknowledge that one has a price, that one's freedom can be bought. Both are about the struggle of the world seeing you as a commodity. In doing so, Jacobs disrupts an easier narrative of progress. I was a slave and now I am free, and instead, as my students and I discuss in class, gestures to the limitations of a world that hinges on economic value or an acceptance of capitalism as the most critical measure of the world. She states that she and her children are free, but tellingly, this is one of the last things she says in her book, the dream of my life is not yet realized, right? And I want us to think about how important this notion of the dream has been for Black radical traditions. I'm thinking, of course, about Dr. King, whose literal speech is, I have a dream, right? For my literature students, and I think this was mentioned earlier too, but Langston Hughes, right, his poem Harlem literally is what happens to a dream deferred that Lorraine Hansberry then takes as part of her A Raisin in the Sun play, right? So I'm thinking about the dream, the speculative, right? Freedom as defined and borne out through the defining parameters of the state means that what Jacobs wishes to see are not yet, right? It is this not yet that I think Sojourner Truth was offering as well. This dream, we do not know what it will be, but we know there is something more and something different from this. Or, as Fannie Lou Hamer reminded us in the 1960s, nobody's free until everyone's free. Perhaps then, my argument is not that reparations must be a Black feminist project, but rather that reparations, a project that is about freeing, a project that is about imagining a world that we don't yet know how to imagine, has always actually been a Black feminist project. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Puck. Professor Robinson.
So how are we doing out there? Okay, got some goods. That's good. People who have me in class know I do appreciate like a head nod or some kind of, or something, when I ask a question out there. So great. Well, let me thank the people who put this together, Robbie and Jeremy, as people have already done, and let me thank all of you for being here and sticking with us. My panelists have done a great job laying out a lot of the theoretical, intellectual, historical aspects of this conversation. So I thought maybe as I kind of bring it on home here, to engage in a little bit more of a conversation. So I'm going to put my timer on here so I don't go over time. So in thinking about reparations, I think there's a variety of excellent aspects that have already been identified. I want to take a step back, and I want to say, I think another aspect of this conversation that really we have to think about is, what do we mean when we say reparations, right? As a nation, right, as one of my panelists mentioned, in the Democratic Party or even in politics, we have people who are debating this issue, right, Republicans, Democrats. So what are they saying? What do they mean? And I think that's sort of part of where we kind of get stuck. So on the one hand, I think for many of the opponents of reparations, what they mean, or what they think about, is similar to the ways in which we talk about things like political correctness or affirmative action, right? There's this connection between this concept, reparations, and this thing that we don't like, we're uncomfortable with, even if we don't fully know how to articulate it. And in many ways, with reparations in particular, I think, again, not saying all, but for many of the opponents, it comes down to this sense of, I don't want Black people to get something over taxpayers or take our money or get some kind of advantage that they don't deserve, right? That sort of becomes the underlying sentiment is, well, slavery happened a long time ago and those people are long dead, So you guys are coming around here trying to like get some free money. You know, obviously this is, you're taking advantage of the system yet again, right? Go get a job, right? You lazy, go on, right? So as you could imagine, I have some objections to that perspective, but I think it's one that should be taken seriously because I think it's definitely one that's out there. So on the one hand, we have this sense of reparations as this, kind of scam on the system. On the other hand, I think there's also this conversation around reparations that is connoted to mean this is going to be a means to address or perhaps even solve the historic and systemic injustices that African Americans have faced throughout our history and to this day. And perhaps this represents many of the proponents, many of the people who support it. Right, this sense that, okay, we have these problems, as my panelists have mentioned, mass incarceration, housing and wealth inequalities, disparate unemployment, so on and so forth. And so these things, police brutality, these things continue to haunt us. And so perhaps reparations can or should or will be the ultimate kind of nail in the coffin to address all those ills. And so I think that sometimes that becomes these sort of two perspectives that are kind of talking past each other in many ways. I have my objections to that perspective as well. In part, as Dr. Kumar said, I'm not sure it's going to actually solve all the problems that we really, are hoping that it will. So what do we do? How do I think about this and maybe how to move the conversation forward? One thing that I think is helpful as I think about this topic is to think about how if we remove the kind of racial element of it and we just think about, okay, let's look at other examples that may kind of help shed some light on this. I think about, it's not that uncommon for our nation or for society, perhaps globally, to think that people who have suffered some kind of wrong deserve some kind of effort to repay that wrong. And perhaps even for people who didn't immediately suffer the wrong, but who are the kids of the people who suffered that wrong, that there should be some effort to say, I'm sorry, and maybe this will be a token of our acknowledgement of that wrong. I think about this current opioid crisis as an example of this, right? Where we have city, state, federal lawsuits happening right now, suing opioid makers saying, you created this wrong, right? And even if the individual people who got addicted, they may have passed away, but their children or their families or their communities deserve some kind of compensation. I think about the Boeing 737 crisis, or crashes that happened not long ago, and lawsuits around that, right? Again, the sense that, yeah, that sounds fair. There should be some kind of fair compensation. And then, as was mentioned earlier, the history of Japanese Americans' internment, right, being another example. So in many ways, I think we as a nation aren't that weirded out by the idea that even if the individual people who may have suffered directly have passed away, that there's a broader harm that should be addressed. I think that makes sense. And thinking about those examples kind of helps me think through that. So kind of putting all that together, the last piece I want to kind of put out there is if you're kind of like me and you're kind of like, okay, this sounds like an idea that sort of makes sense in theory. Maybe I'm not so sure about the details. I have to look at the specific proposals, but at least as a concept, should our nation express some kind of sorrow for what happened to Native Americans? Yeah, African Americans. Yeah, make it. The list goes on, right? I mean, there's a variety of wrongdoing that should be atoned for. This takes me to my last point, which is the current legislation that many of the Democratic candidates have been referring to. So this is House Bill 40, HR 40. You want to Google it later, not right now. H.R. 40. And this is a proposal which has actually been introduced for like the last 30 years, right? And why hasn't it gone very well? It never like gets past committee. Why? I think part because of those like competing connotations that I mentioned earlier. But what does this bill actually say? Right, so I'm gonna read a little bit of it. It says, the bill is intended to address the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery in the United States and the 13 colonies between 1619 and 1865, and to establish a commission to study and consider a national apology and proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery, its subsequent de jure and de facto racial and economic discrimination against African Americans, and the impact of these forces on living African Americans, to make recommendations to the Congress on appropriate remedies and for other purposes. Okay, a lot of words there. Basically, what the legislation proposes is to create a commission that would study the history and the ongoing impacts of slavery, and to make recommendations to the Congress about what we might do about it. That's it. Study it, make recommendations. That sounds pretty reasonable to me. I would like to see the fruits of that study and hear those recommendations. Then I can be like, okay, well, is it going to be direct payments? I don't know. Is it going to be, scholarships? Is it going to be, some educational program that's even not like direct money? Those are all potential proposals that I'd be curious to hear about. So to conclude, right, I mean, again, H.R. 40, if you want to Google it, look it up later on. This is a proposal that basically says that we as a nation should kind of just look into it. And that seems to me like a great way of sort of trying to get past some of these extreme positions one way or the other. Maybe even we can get some of Kumar's, Dr. Kumar's critique in there to say, well, what should be done? How do we acknowledge it educationally, politically, economically, and sort of move forward, or at least have some kind of genuine engagement as a nation? Thank you.
Once again, thank you to all of our panelists for your contributions. We have some time for Q&A. I know y'all like, we've been sitting here for like an hour and a half and we're ready to bounce. No. We have some time for Q&A, and I want to run this. I have a few questions, so selfishly I have the podium, therefore I'm going to ask a couple of questions. I also want to invite you to, if you have questions for one another, to kind of briefly ask some questions, but I also want to give members of our audience an opportunity to ask any questions that they may have in the time that we have left. So I wrote down about a dozen questions. I've narrowed it just to a few, though, in the interest of time. But the first question I have was inspired by Dr. Kumar's commentary, which is one of willingness to have difficult conversations. And it's kind of a philosophical question about why aren't we willing to have these important conversations, particularly as they relate to past atrocities. I mean, we're not the only ones, as you pointed out. Slavery existed in lots of places in the New World, African slavery, most of which didn't occur here. But no place is really willing to, in earnest, have these conversations. And I guess my question philosophically is, why does anybody on our panel feel that that's the case?
I'll take a stab at it. Well, I think in the case of slavery and reparations from slavery, it's a matter of who controls the memory and the legacy. When you look at questions of slavery and the impact of slavery and reparations and government intervention on behalf of people that need it, I think it's largely dictated by who controls the memory. And when we look at the post-Civil War era, the people who are writing the history of the Civil War and the history of slavery are, in fact, the same people who owned slaves and went to war to preserve that institution. So we have this memory of the South and of the Civil War that is created in the wake of the war that doesn't really meet reality, right? That Southern slave owners or former Southern slave owners sell this notion of this kinder, gentler institution in which they lifted up these people who couldn't possibly survive by themselves, and then they went to war to preserve their states' rights, which of course we know to be not true in any way. Because the memory is sold as a kinder, gentler memory, then people later have a hard time discussing it, right? So they see, they're fed this legacy and this memory of the Civil War and of the wake of the Civil War, and by the time we get to the 20th century, it's like, well, what are you talking about, right? What inequities exist in the South? And I think ultimately that's the problem. Who controls the memory? Who controls the history books? Who controls the narrative? Fundamentally impacts our conversation. I think within this question of reparations too, it's linked to this idea of big government, right? What the government's telling you to do, or what's the role of the government in everyday lives, and we see it in the wake of the war, right? White Southerners really make a strong case for this idea of states' rights and no government intervention on issues in the South, and we see it play out time and time again, especially as the Civil Rights Movement gears up in the 40s and 50s, that states' rights, Southern Democrats argue right against government intervention, and you can link it all back to the rejection sort of in my own work of the Freedmen's Bureau and federal presence in there, right, as they then tie themselves to this memory of states' rights and a white South. So that's what I see, and that's how I would answer your question. But
I just want to say something briefly to help answer that question, or at least through a U.S. historical perspective. Something I always talk about is the rhetoric of freedom, democracy, right? The idea that there's something exceptional about America, that we're built upon equality, and that what happens if we kind of undo that or open that door to have that conversation? Does it call into question, our entire Constitution, our entire founding fathers, and how we hold these people up as idols and heroic, and we still do that very much? So I think there's a lot of resistance from people in power to even start to have that conversation. And then, very much tied to what Dr. Kumar and Dr. Keating said, I think it absolutely would open a conversation about mass power redistribution and land and wealth redistribution, which is something very oppositional to our current power structure.
I mean, when I think of it from a very general perspective, I think of the world as divided into two phases of history. There's everything that happened before 1950, 1960, and there's everything that happened after. What happened after? Well, we have civil rights, we have United Nations, World Trade Organization, we're all trading, China is not socialist anymore, the USSR, it's all, I mean, we live in civilized times. That's what we want to believe the current world is. And the past is this savage world where half of Europe is killing the other half of Europe, there's slavery in the United States, one part of the world is colonizing the other part of the world, and I mean, people used to actually take trains to go to distant locations, and I mean, it's extremely savage or whatever. But I think the moment that you accept or begin conversations or bring about questions of acceptance, you immediately link these two extremely different worlds. A civilized, current, global, nice and functioning world versus this era of kings and queens and wars and disease and backwardness in every form and racism across the world. You link them together and you accept that that is our inheritance and that's what we have come from and that's who we are at the end of the day. I mean, people, I always start any new field of study by saying we should completely dismiss our idols. And I feel that it's the same way when we think about the United States. I mean, the founding fathers, there's so much kind of this nobility attached to them, but at the end of the day, they were slave owners. Imagine Barack Obama having to accept, I mean, as president saying, we accept our past. Like that would be the greatest paradox of history if someone like Barack Obama had to come and say that we accept our past and we wish to do reparations today. I mean, that would just basically, it would destroy any sense of history that we have amongst ourselves, and it would make the world an extremely uncomfortable place. We accept certain things. We accept ourselves as civilized, innovative, new, liberal beings. I think that's the difference. That's the problem.
I think part of it too is that, and this is jumping off of Dr. Johnson's point in terms of this narrative of exceptionalism, is we don't always think about structure, right? We think about oppression as kind of an individual level thing, like racism is one person saying something mean to me, or homophobia is someone saying something mean to me. Like, that's how we think about it, as opposed to these oppressions, both helping to construct the way particular structures work in the world, as well as being carried out through these structures in the world, right? So if we kind of accept this narrative of exceptionalism, which is about like, I am an individual, like I am responsible only for myself and what I do, as opposed to thinking about it as, if I hold privilege in particular ways, why do I hold privilege in particular ways, right? If someone is disenfranchised in particular ways, why might that person be disenfranchised in particular ways? Like, if we start thinking about it as, how do powers continue to reassert and reaffirm themselves on a kind of larger structural level, I think that both goes to the place of, like, oh, so it's not just about me, right? It's not just about just me in the world, and that disturbs both, as Dr. Kumar's pointing out, like how we imagine the world to be, and it also deeply unsettles how we think about ourselves, right? Like, I want to believe that I am an individual, and one of the most kind of, I think, world-changing observations that happens as we get older is, but I am not, right? The notion of individuality is very linked to, like, manifest destiny, right? So, like, how do we think about structure, and how do we think about individualism in a more critical way that allows us to have particular conversations that we might not be willing to have, right?
So I'm going to say, because there's not enough emergency rooms to contain the trauma. I'm just, you know, for real, right? To your point, that we do like to not think about the past, and when we start to think about the past, there is trauma associated with that. So it's really hard, I think, especially for those of us who work in the academy, to try to find ways to negotiate those conversations. And we're the smart ones. So how difficult is it then for individuals outside of the benefit of the knowledge that we have to try to find a way to not reinsert that trauma and to examine it at the same time? Does that make sense?
And I think, do you mind if I just
No.
make one? You know, I think that not only is it traumatic, right, but there's a disconnect that many people have, and they're able to say, well, I didn't do it.
Right.
Right, exactly.
So I
I'm
didn't,
not responsible.
I didn't, my parents didn't own slaves, or my family wasn't even in the country when slavery existed, or then there's also that other side that you're, well, like the Irish or the Italians or the Jews, they were treated poorly as well, right? And so we know, right, is what some people will say. We know about those traumas and that racism. So I think that people grapple with, you know, how do you accept accountability for society when you aren't physically engaging in those activities, right?
I know that some of you have, speaking of us being in the academy, have this thing called class in a while. So I did want to give members of our audience an opportunity. If anybody had a question for our panelists, I did want to throw to you before you bolt out of here en masse. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Let's see if this thing works.
I think there's somebody.
Thank you. So I just, in hearing this, it was kind of resonating something that I thought of, this idea of, and I'm just a student, right? So, but of pleading the fifth. Have we taken a stance of pleading the fifth, where we cannot admit the guilt that we have, and as we struggle with this duality of being extraordinary but also being savage, that our story as a country is trying to control the savage, and the savage was always within. So that was my thought.
I mean, I don't think this will, I mean, yes, I think there's a sense of like, there's both the trauma of how do I grapple, right? But there's also this sense of I don't want to acknowledge, right? And there's I think part of what emerges is, and this, I was thinking about this as I was writing my thing. Again, that moment of Harriet Jacobs troubling, like slave and free as a kind of binary. There's a really important scholar named Walter Benjamin who says in this really beautiful piece, he says, a document of civilization is also always a document of barbarism. Right? So, and I think this is something that we are grappling with, right? Like, we always talk about, particular countries will always kind of say, you know, we are democratic, we are bringing freedom, like we do, like, and it's not just the US, right? Like, various countries do this. I mean, Scotland literally, like, during the, like, leading up to the referendum, they were like, we don't do that. Like, we are, like, all accepting and we love everyone and so on and so forth. And one of the things that Benjamin and I think Jacobs is forcing us to think about, precisely as your question is asking, is how, like, civilization and barbarism are not actually opposites, right? That the project of civilization in the world has also always been a project of barbarism, right? And I think to think about it that way is, again, deeply uncomfortable, because we want to think, I mean, I'm sure some of you are excited about the new Star Wars movie coming out, right? But we want to think like there's a good side and there's a bad side, and like that's kind of how the world operates. And it's like, well, what do you do if what we believe to be good was actually carried out through the committing of all the bad, right? Like, how do we deal with that, right? So I don't know if that's necessarily answering your question, but I do think it's something that I would imagine all of us like think about very deeply in our work and in our personal lives, right? I don't know.
Yeah, I would just add on to that as well. I think it's a great question, and I think it kind of connects to the Mohammed's question. Sort of the idea, using maybe the Star Wars analogy, that not only do we want to think about there's a good and a bad, but I think we as a nation want to assume that we're fighting on the good side, right? And that perhaps if there's like an evil empire out there, we're on the side of the guys who are like gonna save the day and like bring down the bad doers, the evil doers. And so that kind of notion obviously works with trauma and historically, but I would just add another element to it that maybe hasn't been said yet, which is I think in the contemporary moment, it can be very useful for people in power to use those kinds of ideas to then kind of whip up or to inspire support. And so, for example, just try to put a finer point on it, historian Ibram Kendi in Stand From the Beginning, his book sort of talks about how anti-racist ideas change and shift over time. And oftentimes what you have are people in power during the Civil War or whatever who, in an effort to sort of manipulate or to take advantage of, say, rich white people trying to take advantage of poor white people, it can be useful to say, well, we need to work together so that we can make sure those black people sort of stay down, right? Or in a modern day context, if people are like, well, I'm in power and I want to stay elected, vote for me so I can keep them people from taking your tax money over some simple, stupid idea that happened, 150 years ago, right? That sort of has a way of becoming a useful political tool even in the moment, as we both try to continue to frame ourselves as the heroes, but also try to say any effort to sort of undermine our kind of hero self-perception is itself an attack or un-American or, deserves to be defeated. So vote for me, so I'll defeat them, kind of a thing.
Good versus bad. Any other questions from our attendees? Yes, sir.
Hello, so I just had a question. The concept of reparations, it's this huge, it almost feels like an impossible task to complete. I mean, the first step is, of course, an admission that you did something wrong, and that's probably going to be the hardest part. But after that, I'm curious, what steps would you take, if you were in charge of this program? How do you compensate for something like that? I mean, because if you just, cut a check for it, aren't you saying that our atrocities are, equivalent to however much you're paying out. I'm just not sure on how you would ever repay that without just admitting you're wrong, and then where do you move on and improve from it?
Great question. I'll throw one out there, and I really appreciated Kumar's, if you pay for it, then somehow it's done. That doesn't seem very real. There's a really wonderful artist, a visual artist, I've been trying to think of his name, who's gone back to famous works of art and put in the people who are missing, right? So you see the fabulous picture of Marie Antoinette, and you also see the little black woman dressing her, and the guy who's holding the water, so that you begin to get a sense of what the whole world is. And I think that for me, one of the positives in the moment we're in now is that history is being rewritten in those ways, because I think that does make it, it does begin to make it easier to put our heads around what actually happened when we begin to see who else is in the picture, because for so long they were absent. So that would be one thing, for example, the ethnic studies bill, so that our sense of the world as a community is enlarged. I'd like the cash too.
Yeah, I think it's a fundamental problem, right? How do you make up for 350 years now of persecution and racism that fundamentally impacted one group's ability to successfully navigate American society? And that's what we're looking at. And it's impacted not only by the long history of it, right, but by groups that are actively working against it, groups that are actively working against acknowledging, the harshness of slavery, or the impact of slavery, or the impact of Reconstruction or the Jim Crow South. So education, yes, is one mode through which this can be changed, but I think that we're fighting against a systemic issue that it first has to be acknowledged, right? And not everybody's even willing to acknowledge it, so that's a problem, in my opinion.
I think piggybacking off that, there are several institutions that, so for example, Princeton Seminary and a few other seminaries actually have acknowledged their part in kind of a past of slavery. And what most of them have done, at least in part, has been to try to encourage education, right, as part of the payment, because that's been one of the greatest points of resistance, has been to even acknowledge that this was a problem, or that this happened, or that it was as bad as it was. And so while they aren't necessarily individually writing a check to folks, they are investing in curriculum and trying to ensure that, at least in their spheres of control, there is a conversation that isn't just one of triumph and it wasn't so bad and so on and so on. I think the challenge, though, is if going back to the discussion earlier, one of the challenges is so many people who are unwilling to even entertain that conversation. As Dr. Keating just said, people who are actively pushing back against any of that conversation being had. There was a good example several years ago with the Texas has a state school board where they adopt textbooks for the entire state, so they have a lot of say in books that are adopted nationwide, and how they were trying to reframe for example, the transatlantic slave trade by referring to it simply as the triangular trade. Right. They were trying to and eliminate kind of other references.
Slaves were immigrants.
Immigrants.
Yes, slaves were immigrants. Yes, and so on. So that's, I think, where the real tension is you have individual entities who are kind of owning up to their part in these past atrocities in the way that they can, without cutting a check, because they're not in a position to do that. But you have so many people who are pushing back, and the real question is, why are you pushing back? Why are you afraid to look? So,
a Republican congressman said a few months ago publicly that the Civil War was about states' rights. And it's patently untrue. It's been proven, untrue. And how do you say that? How do you say that on CNN? It's just this is part and parcel of the problem.
I'm hoping, sorry, I just want to say, and I'm hoping none of my senior colleagues are here because I might get in trouble for saying this, but The argument that I have around reparations with some people is that they'll say, but if we pay the money, like if we actually, I mean, as I said, right, the University of Glasgow is paying 20 million pounds, but actually what they calculated, it's more like 200 million, right? So people will say, you know, I believe in this, but if we actually do it, then like the world as we know it will crumble or be destroyed or whatever. And I'm always like, is that a bad thing? Right? And I don't mean that like in a kind of rhetorical, nonsensical way. Like I think about it as someone who really loves like science fiction and fantasy. Like science fiction and fantasy, Star Wars or otherwise, is always about like what else is possible, right? So I'm not so invested in the question of like, how do we do this if this dismantles everything we know, right? Because I think precisely as I was trying to kind of bring up around someone like Harriet Jacobs or Sojourner Truth is they're like, you're right, it will destroy the world as we know it. But what we want to believe is that whatever comes after can be better, right? Like the destruction of slavery in the South, and Dr. Keating can obviously speak more about this, but the destruction of slavery in the South was like, we are, like, what are we gonna do? Like everything we have known, like what are we gonna do? And it was like, you're right. What does this provide? Like, it provides us with an opportunity of maybe not starting over, but starting again, right? And I think that's a really important thing for us to think about, that my investment is not, how do we do this and also keep things the way they are, right? My question is, how do we do this and use reparations as a way to think differently about relationality in the world, right? Like, as opposed to just, can we do it and then say we're done, right? So, again, no senior colleagues, I hope, are in the room, right?
Well, I think you know, we've lost a considerable part of our group because they have class, and I presume some of you still do too. So, unless there's further conversation that you would like to initiate, I will adjourn the panel. But I do thank all of you for coming out. I appreciate you sticking it out and the questions that you asked, and I really appreciate my colleagues for all of their insights. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.